Good morning, everybody. We are we are in a new story today. We are starting a story, and it's called "The Story of Sindbad the Sailor." If you have purchased this book, it would be the very last story in the book, I believe. The Seven Voyages of Sindbad the Sailor. The version that we have chosen to use is slightly different, and it is a PDF file. So I have included that for you with this video. It's called The Story of Sindbad the Sailor. Now, if you remember the stories that we talked about for the folk literature, remember that these stories take place in an area of the world that is between the continent of Africa and the continent of Asia. It's that central area that we call the Middle East. It consists of countries such as Iraq, Iran, Turkey, clearly Saudi Arabia, those areas. This story, the story of Sinbad the Sailor, is based on the experiences of merchants from Iraq when they were trading with merchants in the East Indies and China. So that's what this particular story is based on. And it is said that this story, Sinbad the Sailor, it influenced more recent stories by other authors such as Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver's Travels. And what this story shows us is just like Aladdin, that great things can happen to people who are brave and adventurous. That's what this story shows us. Remember that this is more folk literature, the story of Sinbad the Sailor or the Seven Voyages of Sinbad. And there are six things that define folk literature. Can you remember them? Say them with me. The first one, there is not one true author. And just like Aladdin, the story of Sinbad the Sailor it's based on the experiences of merchants. So each of those merchants had their own story. So it's not based on one true author. It began as an oral story. That means it was originally told orally, so by voice, and then there. So that means that there's many versions in print because as people wrote it down, it changed slightly. The characters in every story are either totally good or totally bad. We do not have characters who are somewhere in between. They're either totally good or totally evil. Another thing, there unrealistic or unbelievable things happen in this story. The stories always have a lesson or a moral that they want to teach us. And then finally, the sixth characteristic is that the stories, folk literature, are set in a vague time of long ago. So we cannot really pinpoint the time that the story is taking place. So let's go ahead and begin the story of Sinbad the Sailor. I'm going to read it from my PDF file. I printed it out because it's not possible for me to have my PDF version up and for you also to see me. And I think it's important, more important, that you see that I'm reading than it is that you see the text as I'm reading along. You can pull up your PDF file if you would like to do that. In the reign of the same caliphate, Harun al-Rashid, of whom we have already heard, there lived at Baghdad a poor porter called Hindbad. One day, when the weather was excessively hot, he was employed to carry a heavy burden from one end of town to the other. Being much fatigued, he took off his load and he sat upon it near a large mansion. Excuse me. Let me get a drink. He was much pleased that he stopped at his place, for an agreeable smell of wood and aloes and of pastels that came from the house, mixing with the scent of the rose water, completely perfumed and embalmed the air. Besides, he heard from within a concert of instrumental music, accompanied with the harmonious notes of nightingales and other birds. The charming melody and the smell of several sorts of savory dishes made the porter conclude that there must be a feast, and great rejoicings within. His business seldom leading him that way, he knew not to whom the mansion belonged. But he went to some of the servants, whom he saw standing at the gate in magnificent apparel, and asked the name of the proprietor. How, replied one of them, do you live in Baghdad and not know that this is the house of Sindbad the sailor, the famous voyager who has sailed around the world? The porter lifted up his eyes to heaven and said loud enough to be heard, Almighty creator of all things, consider the difference between Sindbad and me. I am every day exposed to fatigues and calamities and can scarcely get coarse barley bread for myself and my family, while happily Sindbad profusely expends immense riches and leads a life of continual pleasure. What has he done to obtain such a lot from the a lot so agreeable? And what have I done to deserve one so wretched? While the porter was thus indulging his melancholy means extreme sadness. A servant came out of the house and, taking him by the arm, bade him follow him, for Sindbad, his master, wanted to speak to him. The servant brought him to the great hall, where a number of people sat round a table covered with all sorts of savory dishes. At the upper end sat a comely, venerable gentleman with a long white beard, and behind him stood a number of officers and domestics, all ready to attend to his pleasure. This person was Sindbad. Hindbad, whose fear was increased at the sight of so many people and of a banquet so scrumptious, saluted the company, trembling. Excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. Sindbad bade him to draw near, and seating him at his right hand, served him himself. He gave him excellent wine, of which there was an abundance on the sideboard. Sindbad had himself heard the porter complain through the window, and this it was that induced him to have him brought in. So because Sinbad had heard Hindbad complaining outside his window, he decided that he was going to bring Hindbad into his company. When the repast was over, that means the meal, Sinbad addressed his conversation to Hindbad and inquired his name and his employment. And he said, I wish to hear from your own mouth what it was you lately said in the street. At this request, Hindbad hung his head down in confusion, and he replied, My lord, I confess that my fatigue put me out of humor and occasioned me to utter some indiscreet words, which I beg you to pardon. Do not think I am so unjust, resumed Sinbad, as to resent such a complaint. But I must rectify your error concerning myself. You think, no doubt, that I have acquired without labor and trouble at the ease and indulgence which I now enjoy. But do not mistake, I did not obtain the happy condition without enduring for several years more trouble of body and mind than can well be imagined. Yes, gentlemen, he added, speaking to the whole company, I assure you that my sufferings have been of a nature so extraordinary as would deprive the greatest miser of his love of riches. And as an opportunity now offers, I will, with your leave, relate the dangers I have encountered, which I think not be uninteresting to you. That's our introduction to Sinbad. So we see Sinbad in his home entertaining a bunch of guests, and Hindbad, who is a poor merchant, is walking by and he hears the music and he smells the smells, and he thinks that Sinbad has come into this money possibly by birth so that he didn't have to earn it and that he has this easy lifestyle and he doesn't have to do anything with it. And Sinbad is about to correct him about that. He says, Wait a minute, Hindbad, that is not true. Listen to my story. Now we are entering the first voyage of Sindbad. My father was a wealthy merchant of much repute. He bequeathed me a large estate, which I wasted in riotous living. I quickly perceived my error and that I was misspending my time, which is of all things the most valuable. I remember the saying of great Solomon, which I had frequently heard from my father. A good name is better than precious ointment. And again, wisdom is good with an inheritance. Struck with these reflections, I resolved to walk in my father's ways, and I entered into a contract with some merchants, and I embarked with them on a board ship we had jointly fitted out. We set sail and steered our course toward the Indies, through the Persian Gulf, which is formed by the coasts of Arabia Felix on the right and those of Persia on the left. At first, I was troubled with seasickness, but speedily recovered my health and was not afterwards subject to that complaint. That means at first he was seasick, and then he got his sea legs and he was over it. In our voyage, we touched several islands where we sold or exchanged our goods. One day, while under sail, we were becalmed near a small island, but little elevated above the level of the water and resembling a green meadow. The captain ordered his sails to be furled and permitted such persons as so were inclined to land. Of this number, I was one. What that means is that the captain saw an island and he said, anybody that wants to go ashore can go ashore. I'm going to put the boat right here. Go ahead and row ashore. But while we were enjoying ourselves and eating and drinking and recovering ourselves from the fatigue of the sea, the island on a sudden trembled and shook us terribly. The trembling of the island was perceived on board the ship, and we were called upon to re embark speedily, or we shall be lost. For what we took for an island proved to be the back of a sea monster. The nimblest got into the sloop. The sloop is a special sailboat. Others betook themselves to swimming, but as for myself, I was still upon the island when it disappeared in the sea. I had only time to catch hold of a piece of wood that we had brought out of the ship to make a fire. Meanwhile, the captain, having received those on board who were in the sloop, taken up some of those who swam, resolved to improve the favorable gale that had just arisen, and hoisting his sails, pursued his voyage, so that it was impossible for me to recover the ship. So Aladdin, not Aladdin, Sindbad had been abandoned by the captain. Thus I was exposed to the mercy of the waves all the rest of the day and the following night. And by the time I found my strength gone and despairing of saving my life, when happily a wave threw me against an island. The bank was high and rugged, so that I could scarcely have gotten up had it not been for some roots of the trees which I had found within reach. When the sun arose, though I was very feeble, both from the hard labor and want of food, I crept along to find some herbs fit to eat, and I had the good luck not only to procure some, but likewise to discover a spring of excellent water, which contributed much to recover me. After this, I advanced farther into the island, and at last I reached a fine plain where I perceived some horses feeding. I went toward them when I heard a voice of a man, who immediately appeared and asked me who I was. I related to him my adventure, after which, taking me by the hand, he led me to a cave where there were several other people, no less amazed to see me than I was amazed to see them. I partook of some provisions which they offered me. I then asked them what they did in such a desert place, to which they answered they were grooms belonging to the Maharaja, sovereign of the island, and that every year they brought thither to the king's horses for pasturage. They added that they were to return home on the morrow, and had I been one day later, I must have perished, because the inhabited part of the island was a great distance off, and it would have been impossible for me to have gotten thither without a guide. That means he never would have found his way to the part of the island where the other people lived. The next morning, they returned to the capital of the island, took me with them, and presented me to the Maharaja. He asked me who I was and by what adventure I had come into his dominions. After I had satisfied him, he told me he was much concerned for my misfortune, and at the same time ordered that I should want for nothing, which commands his officers were so generous and careful to see that were exactly fulfilled. That means the Maharaja was happy to see him. He asked him about how he had come to be there, and the Maharaja, who is like a king, decided that Sinbad shouldn't need anything. And so he attended to everything that he needed. His servants gave him everything he needed and everything he wanted. Being a merchant, I frequented men of my own profession, and particularly inquired for those who were strangers, that perchance I might hear news from Baghdad, or find an opportunity to return. For the Maharaja's capital is situated on the seacoast and has a fine harbor where ships arrive daily from different quarters of the world. I frequented also the society of the learned Indians, and I took delight to hear them converse. But withal, I took care to make my cohort regularly to the Maharaja, and conversed with the governors and the petty kings, his tributaries that were all about him. They put 1,000 questions respecting my country, and I, being willing to inform myself as to their laws and customs, asked them concerning everything that I thought was worth knowing. There belongs to this king an island named Casal. They assured me that every night a noise of drums was heard there, whence the mariners fancied that it was a residence of Gigaio. I determined to visit this wonderful place, and in my way thither saw fishes of 100 and 200 cubits long. That means really big. The occasion more fear than hurt, for they are so timorous that they will fly upon the rafting of two sticks or boards. I saw likewise other fish about a cubit in lake that had heads like owls. At one day at the port, after my return, the ship arrived in which I had embarked at Bushora. I knew at once the captain, and I went and asked him for my bales. I am Sindbad, said I, and those bales marked with his name are mine. When the captain heard me speak thus, heavens, he exclaimed, whom can we trust in these times? I saw Sindbad perish with my own eyes, as did also the passengers on board. And yet you tell me that you are Sindbad. What impudence is this? That means what rudeness. And what a false tale to tell in order to possess yourself of what does not belong to you. Have patience, replied I. Do me a favor to hear what I have to say. The captain was at length persuaded that I was no cheat, for there came people from his ship who knew me, paid me great compliments, and expressed much joy at seeing me alive. At last he recollected me himself, and embracing me, heaven be praised, he said, for your happy escape. I cannot express the joy that it affords me. There are your goods. Take them and do as you please. I took out what was my most valuable in my bales and presented them to the Maharaja, who, knowing my misfortune, asked me how I had come by such rarities. I acquainted him with the circumstance of the recovery. He was pleased at my good luck. He accepted my present and in return gave me one much more considerable. Upon this, I took leave of him and went aboard the same ship after I had exchanged my goods for the commodities of that country. I carried with me the wood of aloes, sandals, camphor, nutmegs, cloves, pepper, and ginger. We passed by several islands and at last arrived at Basora, from which I came to this city, with the value of 100,000 sequins. Sinbad stopped here and he ordered the magicians to proceed with their concert, which the story had interrupted. When it was evening, Sinbad sent for the purse of 100 sequins, and giving it to the porter, said, take this, Hindbad, return to your home, and come back tomorrow to hear more of my adventures. The porter went away astonished at the honor done him and the present made him. The account of this adventure proved very agreeable to his wife and his children, who did not fail to return thanks for what the Providence had sent them by the hand of Sinbad. Hindbad put on his best robe the next day and returned to the bountiful traveler, who received him with a pleasant air and welcomed him heartily. When all of the guests had arrived, dinner was served and continued a long time. When it ended, Sinbad, addressing himself to the company, said, gentlemen, be pleased to listen to the adventures of my second voyage. They deserve your attention even more than those of the first. Upon which everyone held his peace, and Sinbad proceeded. We are going to continue with the second voyage tomorrow. In your literature interactive notebook, I need you to open it up and think about this question and then answer it using complete sentences. Let's think about the question first. How did Sinbad show service at the end of his journey? making him the hero of this story. At the end of his journey, how did he show service? And who did he show this service to? Remember back where he was. He was on an island. The what the king, which is not called the king, but he is called something different. I just totally can't remember what he's called. Anyway. Oh, the Maharaja. That's what he is. I am so sorry. It escaped my mind. Remember, he was taken to the Maharaja on the island, and remember what happened to him there. And think about at the end of the story when Sindbad was returned to his ship and he was able to get back his things that he had left on the ship. They called them bales, and that was all of the items that he had brought onto the ship for trading, because remember, he was a merchant. Think about the service that he performed at the end of this story, which truly made him a hero. And then continue on through that. When he was finished telling about his first journey, he performed another service to another man. Let's think about that. Once you have these thoughts in your head, in complete sentences, I want you to answer this question. How did Sinbad show service at the end of this journey, making him the hero of this story? Go ahead and write it down, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.